Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 11th, 2022. There are cracks beginning to appear in what was considered the united position of the NATO alliance. And this is happening at a moment not too soon because the war danger continues to escalate. The demands coming from the war party for more weapons, more sanctions are incessant. They're continuing by the hour. But we're seeing significant breaks from that. Let's take the case of Italy, which is one of the most important. Italy, which is an industrial power, Italy, which has been reluctant to give up its sovereignty after post-World War II, the birth of the Renaissance. It has a great tradition, but has been dragged into the mud with the NATO policy, the European Union policy. And now we're seeing a shift underway from Italy. And interestingly, we saw this yesterday with Mario Draghi, the Prime Minister of Italy, with his visit to the White House. Draghi, of course, has been London's man for a long time. He was the head of the European Central Bank. He was on the Britannia yacht when the plot was laid out to dismantle Italy in the early 1990s. As Prime Minister, he's done NATO's bidding and the EU's bidding. But all of a sudden, he seems to be digging in his heels. He spoke about how we have to stand together, support Ukraine, have to keep the sanctions going. But then he virtually pleaded that the fighting must stop. And he said there must be a ceasefire and, quote, credible negotiations. Now, why is London's man calling for credible negotiations? Well, it has to do more with Italy than with London, because what we're seeing is that the London policy is still the dominant one in Europe, which is fighting, which is war to degrade Russia. This is what the Biden administration is sticking with. Boris Johnson is one of the leaders of this. Stoltenberg and NATO are continuing to insist that the war to the end must be carried out. So, and for what reason? Because they are insisting that Russia and China must not be allowed to consolidate a potential financial system outside of the Great Reset. And the threat of a coalition of sovereign nations cooperating in investment in physical economy rather than propping up a collapsing bubble, that's the threat that was explicit in the Western decision to degrade Russia, to attack, run economic warfare against Russia, and so on. Now, what else is going on in Italy? Well, there's an industrialist named Carlo de Benedetti, one of the more important oligarchs in Italy, who's not a good guy and can't really be trusted. But he issued a statement calling for Europe to break with the Washington-London policy axis. And the Secretary General of the party that De Benedetti basically set up, the Democratic Party of Italy, a man named Enrico Letta, came out with a very strong demand that Europe unite and, quote, move now for peace, unquote. In other words, an anti-war position in Italy. Now, also another nominally Italian institution, the Vatican, headed by let's just say, a very complicated and complex figure, Pope Francis, who also can't be fully trusted. But he stated the obvious. He said that NATO bears responsibility, not Putin, for the war in Ukraine. Then you have Italian military figures like General Mini, who is the head of NATO forces in the Balkans War. He's now called for dismantling NATO. So you see this move in Italy, which is very much across the board. Now, where else? In Greece, there's a growing movement against the continued shipment of weapons and other humanitarian aid into Ukraine. The Greeks, of course, know NATO quite well because NATO supported the general's coup in 1967, and the European Union has imposed massive austerity on Greece. So there's a potential for motion coming from Greece as well. Even Germany, you had 27 intellectuals sign a statement critical of Scholz's commitment to continue the war. And now it's had signatures from over 300,000 people. So in Germany, a reconstitution of an anti-war movement, well, it couldn't come at a more opportune time. Now, the question then is, what about the United States? We know in the United Kingdom, while there are people like George Galloway and others who are real exceptions, the political establishment in England is fully committed to this war because it's totally controlled by the banks and financial institutions of the City of London. The United States, same thing in terms of the Congress, in terms of both political parties, in terms of the institutions of government, the executive branch, and so on. But we're seeing military veterans speaking out. For example, Colonel Douglas McGregor, Colonel Danny Davis, an Afghan whistleblower, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served under Colin Powell and has been repenting for what Powell did for many, many years. Scott Ritter, the former chief weapons inspector in Iraq, who's been absolutely brilliantly outspoken against this war. Lieutenant Colonel retired Tulsi Gabbard, who has been very much outspoken, and Colonel Richard Black, the former chief of the Army's Criminal Law Division of the JAG Corps at the Pentagon. Black did an interview with the Schiller Institute, which I'll link at the bottom of the description page, which was a very sharp warning of the danger of World War III going to nuclear war, a call for a diplomatic settlement, and just as in the case of all these other military veterans I've mentioned, call for the diplomatic settlement to respect Putin's demand for security guarantees for Russia. Now, the problem in the US is that the media is controlled by the same financial cartels and corporate cartels that run the war party. And so we have lies, censorship. This just dominates the US airspace. Now, what are they protecting, though? They're protecting the Great Reset. They're protecting the Green New Deal. This is where big finance and the corporate cartels carry out a psychological warfare operation against the American people. The best example of this is the cover-up of the Nazis in Ukraine. This should be the biggest scandal that the United States government under Biden, the British government, the NATO countries are giving weapons to a regiment and several regiments of militia that pledge allegiance to the World War II Nazis of the Galician SS under Stefan Bandera. These were killers. These were genocidal maniacs who joined with the Waffen-SS to carry out the extermination of, quote, non-Ukrainian people. And they were instrumental in the Maidan coup. They were supported by Victoria Nuland, supported by Biden, who was the on-the-scene spokesman for the government for the Obama administration for the Ukraine coup in 2014. The neo-Nazis were crucial for that coup to succeed. They also were the ones who led the fighting against the ethnic Russians in Donbass, which resulted in at least 14,000 deaths, the vast majority of those deaths Russian ethnic civilians. So why is this being covered up by the Western media? Well, Putin raised the issue repeatedly. He demanded that the support for these Nazis be stopped. But the Western war hawks deny that they're Nazis. Now they're praising them, praising the Azov regiment as valiant fighters for Ukraine. Now, there's a new embarrassment for the Zelensky government. You know, one of the covers for Zelensky is, well, how could there be Nazis supporting Zelensky because he's Jewish? Well, he just posted an Instagram photo of a Ukrainian soldier with the Nazi insignia of the Waffen-SS on his uniform. After it had been posted for several hours, it was taken down, but it was also posted on the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Nazi insignias on Ukrainian army uniforms today. And then they recognized they had to suppress that. That's what we're dealing with here. Caitlin Johnstone, an Australian journalist, said that for a fraction of the amount that's being spent to arm the Ukrainian Nazis, you could have spent that to dismantle their regiments, break up the Nazi movement in Ukraine, and provide security for Zelensky, whose life was threatened by the Nazis. When Zelensky was going to try to implement the Minsk Accord for a settlement in the Donbass, he was threatened with being found hanging from a tree if he did that by the very Nazis whose photos he's now posting on Instagram. That's the scandal. So we're at a moment of extreme danger, of war, of financial collapse, of economic breakdown, of hunger, of disease worldwide. The time has come to settle this war honorably and with justice. And that means to honor the demands of Putin for security guarantees, not just for Russia, but also for Ukraine. And then start addressing the global financial breakdown, which threatens over 1 billion people with starvation if nothing is done to stop it. We have to say no to Malthusian globalization, no to fascism, no to free trade and depopulation, and instead proceed with a commitment to physical economic development of all sovereign nation states. That's the way to end this war. And the fact that we're seeing cracks now appearing in the facade of the NATO countries is a good sign that we have to build on and that you have to help us make sure it comes to fruition. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again tomorrow.